Good evening, everyone. My name is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to greet you all this evening concerning tonight's conversation about East Bay Township PFAS investigations. Before we get to our first presenter tonight, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping matters here with Zoom. We just want to let you all know that all of your lines are all muted, so means we won't be able to hear you, but you'll be able to hear us hopefully. And I will share with you some information coming up on how you can communicate with us throughout tonight's conversation. Also want to let you know that we are recording the webinar for future viewing. The recording will be made available through Eagle's YouTube channel and through the MPART page for later viewing in case friends or colleagues were not able to make tonight's meeting. Before we go on any further, I'd like to introduce Abby Hendershot. She is the MPART Executive Director. That's the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. Abby, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Les. Just want to say welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming here tonight. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this important information. We've put together a pretty good presentation of information that we think will be most useful to you. And there will be time at the end, as Les says, to ask questions, get your questions answered. We've got a whole panel of people here ready to take those questions. So let me do introductions before we get too far. As Les says, I am Abby Hendershot, and I'll be doing a quick overview of MPART, what our objectives are, and how we play into this PFAS investigation. Ann Emmington, if you could turn your camera on, Ann Emmington is our project manager for Eagle, and she's been heading up this PFAS site investigation. Rosa Hyman is our Department of Health and Human Services toxicologist. Rosa, if you could turn your camera on, that would be great. We also have Beth Friend, our East Bay Township Supervisor, who will be jumping on to give us some information on the status of the municipal water hookups. We've got Jeremy Hall and Greg Carpenter from the U.S. Coast Guard Station going to be giving us some information on their investigations at the Coast Guard facilities. And then we've got Kevin Klein, the airport director for Cherry Capital Airport, and Adam Siegerlind with Gosling Zubeck, who will also be giving us some information for their investigations status up to date. So let's go ahead and to the next slide. So MPART is a PFAS collaboration structure, we're going to call it. And what it really does is it allows the state of Michigan to take all 7 agencies who have, a really important stake in regulating PFAS, in overseeing how this PFAS investigations happen, and taking all 7 of our agencies and being able to combine the best of our technical teams to really investigate, understand, and respond to these. So like you saw tonight, we have people from DHHS, people from MDOT, people from LARA, Eagle, all on this team to make sure we get the best investigation, action, and response done. So next slide. So MPART was part of an executive order done by Governor Whitmer, and it really has this unique multi-agency approach. It's unlike anything else we've done in the government before, and it leads to really good coordination and cooperation among all the different levels. It directs our implementation and strategy for actions and for response, and gives us a much better leverage for making sure that we protect public health, which is our ultimate goal. Next slide. The other thing that you need to know tonight is that we do have groundwater cleanup criteria. These are groundwater cleanup criteria for the protection of use of that groundwater for drinking water. So for PFOA, it's 8 parts per trillion. PPT is parts per trillion. PFOS is 16 parts per trillion. PFNA is 6 parts per trillion. PFHXS, 51 parts per trillion. HP HFPODA, which is also known as Gen X, is 370 parts per trillion. PFBS is 420, and PFHXA is 400,000 parts per trillion. Those are all effective and enforceable today. So just to make sure everybody understands that that is the current law, and we are using those cleanup criteria to make decisions on public health. Next slide. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Ann Emmington, who's our PFAS investigation site lead. She's going to lead you through some of the actions that have been done to date. So take it away, Ann.
Hi, how is everybody doing tonight? I'm trying to get my cursor up here. Okay. So I'm going to start with what's new since we last met. We met last at the end of January, and we were discussing at that time municipal well replacements or hookups and residential well abandonment. So what's happened since that point in time? We've got some information back from the Cherry Capital Airport and the United States Coast Guard. They did some remedial investigation work in the area where they were sampling soil, groundwater, and pond water. And we have the results of those investigations that we're going to cover with you tonight. The other thing that's really exciting is that the municipal water connections are now complete. Those were began towards the end of February and were completed by March 19th. So all of the 18 residential wells are now hooked up to East Bay Township municipal water, and the residential wells have been abandoned. I just wanted to explain a little bit about what these photos are in the slide. This is a typical investigation. It's not one that the Coast Guard or the Cherry Capital Airport conducted. It was one that Eagle conducted in September of 2020. These are our temporary wells that we installed. I don't know if any of you saw that while you were driving through the neighborhood in September, but this one picture on the left shows south of the railroad track, south of Parsons Road, looking back towards the Coast Guard and the Cherry Capital Airport. The photo on the right is showing looking to the north towards Parsons Avenue and East Avenue E. So this is where we did our investigation, and similar investigations were done by the Coast Guard and the airport in December. I wanted to go over a little bit. This is just a general overview of the investigations that they did. Each of the entities will go through their material and give you a better idea of what they found. But I just kind of wanted to give you a general overview so you could see the connections out here. This is a Google Earth photograph, and at the top of the photograph, you will notice the east arm of Grand Traverse Bay. The stars on the map represent the municipal wells, the residential wells that were identified during my investigation. These wells, like we said earlier, were abandoned, and all of these homes, all 18 of them, were connected to municipal water by March 19th. The circles along Parsons Road is the groundwater investigation that Eagle did in September of 2020. The blue line is the groundwater flow direction in the area. So the water under the ground is moving from the southwest towards the northeast into the Pine Grove subdivision area, which is identified here by 3 Mile Road on the east, Munson Avenue on the north. This is Airport Access Road on the west, and then Parsons Road. So this whole area is Pine Grove subdivision, part of East Bay Township. There might be a little bit of the city along the edge. Excuse me. Then you will see the large area that's covered by the airport, the Coast Guard, and other businesses in the area. Basically, we're looking at an area all the way to 3 Mile Road on the east and Garfield Road on the west. And then we have Parsons Road on the north and Airport Road on the south. We have Cherry Capital Airport, the new terminal on the south part of the parcels. This is the new terminal with the new fire rescue building over here. The old terminal was in the center of the area here. And then we have the Coast Guard to the north of that. These little triangles that you see, the colored triangles, all represent areas where groundwater samples were collected by the Coast Guard or Cherry Capital Airport. These signify where contamination was found during their investigations. The color coding, I'll explain that to you a little bit. The blue color coding shows that those areas were, the groundwater was below drinking water criteria. Then it starts to go up in concentration, with the yellow being a little bit higher, the orange being higher than the yellow, and then the dark orangish red color being the highest concentrations found. What you should take away from this is that there was groundwater contaminated with PFAS found in every area that was investigated, except for the areas with the blue. There was PFAS found in those areas. It was just below our criteria. Excuse me. I need to mention that these are not the only areas that we sent information requests out on. There were some businesses along Arrow Park Drive. There were at least 3 businesses here, and one which had a fire. And that was significant because that we investigate that, because PFAS comes from the AAA foam that is used to put out fires. So we investigated that and found that PFAS was not used to put out that fire. It was just water. We also asked the other entities along Arrow Park Drive to check their material safety data sheets to determine whether or not they were using PFAS in their production materials. And they responded, their environmental people from their companies responded that they did not use PFAS. So at this point in time, the only sources of PFAS that we're aware of are the Coast Guard and Cherry Capital Airport. But I need to tell you that this is an iterative process, that every time you do an investigation, more questions are raised than answers are given. And it usually leads to additional investigations. And as that information is developed and reviewed, then we determine what else needs to be done to define the extent of the contamination, and then what receptors are out there that will be impacted by that contamination. This is just the beginning of the investigations. So there's much more to come in the future, and each of the entities will discuss that. And as they generate information during their investigations, the Eagle is always open to review that information. And if there's other sources that are identified, we're open to looking into those areas as well. But at this point in time, that's all the information that we have. So I will let each one of those entities later on in the presentations give their more specific information for what they found. Now we're going to move on to Rosa Heim. She's a toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Rosa is going to talk to you about PFAS and its health effects. So let me move on to the next slide. Take it away, Rosa.
Thank you, Anne. So first, I'm going to talk about the role of NDHHS and the local health department. So the role of the local health department and NDHHS is to understand the health concerns that the community is facing. For that, we developed a plan to investigate and address the health risk. In this plan, Eagle leads the site investigation, and NDHHS and the local health department lead the public health planning and response. We also evaluate PFAS exposure to residents in the community, in where we recommend public health actions as needed. Next one, please.
Okay.
Thank you. So how people can be exposed to PFAS. So the main way in which people can be exposed to PFAS is by swallowing the PFAS or by ingesting the PFAS. For example, by drinking contaminated water or by eating fish caught from water contaminated by PFAS. So once we know that there are rivers or lakes that have PFAS, we sample the fish. And if the fish have levels of PFAS, especially PFOS, because we know PFOS can bioaccumulate, we issue a Eat Safe Fish guideline for those particular rivers and lakes. Also, people can be exposed to PFAS by incidental swallowing of contaminated soil or dust. And we see this especially in children because of the hand-to-mouth behavior. Also by eating food packaged in material containing PFAS or using some consumer products. It's important to know that the absorption through the skin is typically not a concern. So people can keep using the water to wash their dishes or to showering. Next one, please. So most of the people in the United States have some levels of PFAS in their blood. Here we see a study done by NHANES. In this study, they sample these four PFAS, PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, and PFNA in the blood. And here we see the results. The y-axis here represent the levels of PFAS in the blood, and the x-axis represent years. So we can see how, especially PFOS and PFOA, decrease over time. We see a decrease of PFOS of around 80% and a decrease of PFOA of around 60%. And the reason why these two PFAS has decreased over time is because industry started the reduction of these two contaminants around 2002. So when you have less production of these contaminants, you're going to have less exposure, therefore less absorption to these chemicals in your blood. Next one, please. So there are some health effects that have been associated with PFAS. For example, reduced fertility, high blood pressure, or preeclampsia in pregnant women, a small decrease in infant birth weight, increased cholesterol, especially total cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol, also known as bad cholesterol. Next one, please. Other health effects that have been associated with PFAS are thyroid disease, liver damage, decreased immune system response to vaccines, develop certain type of cancer, in particular kidney and testicular cancer. And we see this mostly with PFOA. Next one, please. But before continuing, I would like also to say that if you have been exposed to PFAS, that not necessarily mean that you are going to develop health effects in the future. Usually people need to be exposed to high levels of PFAS for a long period of time to be more likely than the average person to develop health effects in the future. Again, if you have any question, you have my phone number and my email. Feel free to contact me. Now I'm going to let you with Beth Friend. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Rosa. My name is Beth Friend. I'm supervisor of East Bay Township. I am going to turn off my video to make sure that my bandwidth is sufficient for the presentation. So I titled this a collaborative solution, because it truly was a collaborative solution from the time that Eagle contacted East Bay Township, and we worked with Grand Traverse County Health Department for a solution. So next slide. The original scenario was that 18 homes, and this is a modestly priced subdivision with homes going from about $150,000 to $250,000. located near Traverse City in East Bay Township. And they were thought to have PFAS contaminated drinking wells. And so then subsequent to that, it was determined that in fact they did. With varying degrees, and several of them, as you know, over the maximum contaminant level. So upon knowing that, we looked at the solutions and began immediately starting to work on a design and bid for the project. And our engineer did a sealed bid process where Matt's Underground Utility Services was a successful contractor. That project came in just under $150,000 for that contract. And then we had additional cost with the connection. Typically, when a home connects, they do that independently. They go to the DPW, pull a permit, hire their own contractor, and have it connected. This project basically did all of those homes in one fell swoop, and we facilitated that through the township with this single contractor. We worked, as I mentioned, collaboratively with Eagle and Grand Traverse County, and then through its Brownfield Redevelopment Authority to establish funding that would completely cover the project. And this was very important because through that, we were able to get all 18 homeowners signed on to abandon their drinking well water supply and one independent irrigation well. So Matt's Underground Utility Services had a notice to award on February 1st, and they started work about 2 weeks later, and 2 to 3 weeks later, and they were finished by March 19th. Those wells are no longer in operation. 17 of the wells were capped, and we'll show a picture of that in a second, but 2 of the wells were rendered useless through capping the service lead. And the reason that they were not specifically capped because they were located under the house and you couldn't get access to it. So they've been completely dismantled though, no electricity to the wells. The service lead capped, and they are rendered useless. And then just recently in March, sorry about the typo there, the end of March, we completed the restoration and the hydro seeding on those homes. So literally just yesterday, I approved the full contract payment to Matt's Underground Utility Services. And then we will be submitting those expenses through the $150,000 Eagle grant that the township was awarded under the Alternative Water Supply Grant Agreement. So we'll go to the next slide. This is a picture of the process of capping one of those wells. You'll see moving from left to right, we've got 5 slides of different parts of the process. And in this particular one, they had to pull the drop pipe by hand. But they were able to go ahead and kept that well, filling it with bentonite. So it's and they were out there in all different weather. They had everything from warm days to freezing days, but they were able to get all of it done. And as I said, with all 18 homes, which we were particularly happy about. We'll go to the next slide. And then just in conclusion, I want to reiterate, as I have mentioned, that what a collaborative process this was. We dealt with 4 terrific individuals from Eagle who helped do everything from guide us on, what PFAS was to funding solutions and to what exactly needed to be done. The Board of Trustees at the township, I worked on it, and we engaged our engineer of record and our legal counsel and all of it. And then Grand Traverse County through their Board of Commissioners, as I mentioned, the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority funds is where they funded their $85,000 gap funding through. And we worked with county administration and their executive director of the authority on that. And then of course the health department, which supplied all of the alternate drinking supply during this 3-4 month process. And the Department of Public Works helped coordinate all of the permitting and inspections and so forth. So truly was a collaborative process. And the township was pleased to be able to be a part of that and offer to be part of the solution for those 18 households in the township. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeremy Hall. He is the United States Coast Guard Commanding Officer for the Civil Engineering Unit in Cleveland.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I appreciate the time to address you on this important issue. And I'd like to reiterate that the Coast Guard prioritizes any actions that we need to take to investigate and understand this issue. We're also committed to partnering with EGLE and the Cherry Hill Airport to identify and respond to and mitigate any PFAS issues that we have some responsibility for. As we work through this issue and as we work to understand our role in this issue, I thought it was important to mention before we get into the results of our investigation that we are committed and we have a duty to delivering reliable information to the public. And in order to provide reliable information to you, we're going to follow a framework established under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, and commonly known as CERCLA. And under the CERCLA framework, the first step that we need to take is to conduct a preliminary assessment and site investigation. And that's what we've completed. We've completed the preliminary assessment and site investigation. And that investigation will lead us in new paths and further delineation of this issue so that we can take the actions necessary to be part of the solution to this issue. To help understand what we found, my environmental protection specialist supervisor at the Civil Engineering Unit in Cleveland is also online, and he's going to walk through the data. One thing that I wanted to mention, and you may be wondering why is the Coast Guard from Cleveland representing this issue when it's the Coast Guard in Traverse City, and I think it's worth mentioning that we support Air Station Traverse City directly on these types of issues, but we are part of the Coast Guard and we share the same commitment to the community that the folks there in Traverse City do. We want to make sure that we're doing right by Traverse City and the folks of East Bay Township. And to that end, we want to provide the best information possible as soon as possible to make sure everybody can make informed decisions moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn over the microphone and the video to Mr. Greg Carpenter. Greg, if you could please walk us through the results.
Thank you, Commander. Hello, everyone. I'm Greg Carpenter. I'm Chief Environmental Compliance for District 5 and District 9. District 9 being the Great Lakes states. To give you a little background, because you haven't heard from the Coast Guard yet, is my Commander Hall has expressed once Michigan had placed the borings along Parsons Avenue and alerted us to the potential there might be some PFAS in the groundwater that they sampled. We put the investigation of our site at the highest priority. We went to secure funding and contract a A&E firm to do our investigation at the most expedited manner. So what you'll see today, and I'll try in pursuit of time management, I'll try to go through it without getting too far into the details. You'll see today a summary of that investigative report and the results that we found in placed on site figures. So as you can read through the first slide, the summary of that is PFAS, the common overall acronym of the constituents that make up these chemicals, the ones at which you've been seeing Michigan State talk about, PFAS and PFOA, are found in AFFF. It's a fire suppression foam that we use at the Coast Guard Air Station to protect the lives of the men and women at the Coast Guard and the aircraft for the Coast Guard to support the life-saving mission. We're required by law to do that, everyone, and we're required by law to maintain that so when it is needed, it can actuate as it was designed. So throughout the years, we've maintained and kept this chemical at the air station for that purpose. So in going into this investigation, we knew where we cooked that chemical. We knew where that chemical was used. and it was primarily in the hangar area and vicinity, and an associated retention pond that received waters from that area and could retain and detain it before it released it off our property. And this will make a little bit more sense when you see the next few slides, folks. So basically our first phase of investigation, which was a real general set of samplings across our site, we found PFAS in the groundwater collected at the soil borings and across the site. In one location, we delineated a non-detect, but all the other locations of the 12, there were 11 locations that showed above criteria. So the potential sources that we found at that time are listed as our hangar area, retention pond, and the storm sewer. To upgrading of us, groundwater speaking, as Cherry Capital Airport, but also as Ann Emmington relayed, this area is an industrialized area, especially along Parsons Avenue and a railroad that parallels Parsons Avenue. Going forward, we need to dig into other examples and locations of where sources may have been that during the first review through the state might not have turned over an action or a use that some of those industrial historic companies might have known or documented at the time. So that's a point we need to broadcast for the future investigations. Next slide, please. This slide basically shows the general area of consideration. Starting at the north, you see the community in the Wells, Michigan, Eagle sampled and closed as part of the private potable water wells in the neighborhood. There's 19 green triangles there, the 19th being an irrigation well, the 18th being home potable drinking water wells. It's important to note that that was the first action that anybody should take at a potential investigation of this magnitude and of this risk. And I want to commend Michigan East Bay Township, the health department, for making that happen. That truly is the remedial action that needed to take place to safeguard the public and the further contamination of property and or persons. So I want to thank the community and the citizens for dealing with that and understanding the necessity of that and allowing that to happen. So I want to thank the community for that. And jumping into this slide, you'll see just south of that is where Eagle collected their 10 groundwater sampling data points that showed that there was PFAS in the groundwater at Parsons Avenue. And below that, in the black bold dashed lines, you'll see the Coast Guard Air Station, Traverse City. That's a 16-acre piece of property. Next slide, please. This is a little more restrictive view. It's just a Coast Guard, and it shows those 12 borings that I spoke of earlier. If you look at the key takeaways, one or more of the following PFAS exceeds criteria of 11 to 12 borings that I mentioned, and those are the 4 main criteria that were sampled and shown. The blue line, the blue arrow across the site, everybody, is the approximate groundwater flow direction. So it's flowing northeasternly. The color code you see is at the very top is green. That was a non-detect, folks. So that was an interesting point for us and a point that we're going to center in on in the next investigation. But we basically took samples all along the perimeter and near where we suspected source areas. As I spoke a little bit earlier, the hashed maroon or pink is where we store AFFF and utilize that fire suppression. And if there was a fire or an accidental release, the concrete apron outside of the hangar to the doors are on the south face of that building, it would be exposed. And then as you see the concentric circles, there's a retention basin. The retention pond sits right there to receive any extra fluids and extra rainwater that flushes over that vicinity. Next slide, please. Again, this is a little bit more detailed, folks. You see the Eagle investigation up to the northeast corner of the right, showing their borings and their sampling. And you see a little bit better delineation of how we showed the results in the color code that Ann was speaking of, the blue being non-detect, the yellow below 100 parts per trillion, the orange being between 100 and 1,000 parts per trillion, and the red being between 1,000 and 10,000 parts per trillion, and then the mauve, if you will, the purple being greater than 10,000. It's interesting to note on this first phase, which again, everyone, this is a first cut at it. We got to take a lot more samples connected to these data points so that we understand our own location and how the contaminants exist below the surface and how they're moving. But it's interesting to note that it seems as though the higher concentration are on the right side of our property basin. And then the highest concentration that is found showing on this map was from one of the data points that the state of Michigan collected. Next slide, please. And the reason I spoke of detail in that manner is to kind of set up this slide. And I'll get a little bit technical here. The data start to show like a divide in the contamination, folks, at our property. We did a vertical profile sampling of the aquifer. The aquifer basically is confined. And what that means is below the surface, there's a very nice sand all the way down to roughly 54 to 60 feet. That 60 feet below grade, there's a substantial clay layer. And that's an important piece to know because that clay layer acts as a foundation, if you will, a barrier for any contamination that drops down that seemingly this PFAS chemical does. It will stop. That is a very good thing to have in place in this region because now deeper formations and aquifers are not going to be impacted by contamination that might be above it because of this barrier. And then it'll help us understand how it flows with the groundwater gradient. So if you look at the data, and I know it's kind of hard to see, so I'll walk you a little bit through it without spending too much time on it, everybody. There seems to be on the left side of our property, the western side, a PFOA concentration, and they ranged up from non-detect up to roughly 200 parts per trillion. And then on the right side, the eastern side, we had detections of PFOS, and it ranged from non-detect up to roughly 2,000 parts per trillion. And you can see that the intervals at which we did the vertical aquifer sampling every 10 feet or so, roughly at 10-foot increments. The other important piece was we did not get too close to the clay layer at the depth of 60 feet because we don't want to breach it. And we don't want to do that in the future either, folks, so that we don't compromise anything below that confining layer. And then the green had detection limits below what you would consider actionable. So that was another key piece of information for us moving forward. But again, folks, it's this is our first look. So we try not to draw too many conclusions, but they help us with the next phases of the investigation. Next slide, please. This slide shows roughly the soil sampling that we did. We did soil sampling to see the direct contact numbers, and you can see in the yellow, we had exceedances on those. We took 2 samples and one in and around the source areas that we believe were source areas, and the data shows itself as it is. Next slide, please. This slide is a larger view of what we've just been through, everybody. It shows in the color code where contaminations on the Coast Guard station exist, and with the connection of what there may or may not be between the Coast Guard station and the state's data on their color codes and the residential abandoned and closed private drinking water wells. And you can see the general approximate groundwater flow direction with the blue arrow. Next slide, please. This is the last slide, everybody. We basically hope that we shared the data that we collected, and the final report that will be made available to the public and anyone that wants a copy of that. But the pathway going forward is working collaboratively as we have, everybody. The airport, the state, and the Coast Guard have worked transparently and collaboratively with each other and trying to understand what the regional contamination is. But we first had to each look at our own properties, and we'll continue to do that on the next phase, folks, to better understand what's happening on our properties. And that alludes to what Ann talked about earlier, understanding if there's other sources along that historical adjacent industrial areas, the industrial park to the east, the right of the Coast Guard station, the potential for any sources along the air, the Parsons Avenue with the railroad adjacent to it, and a couple other areas that we've seen on our review of data and the history of the region. So we'll continue to work transparently with all entities. We'll schedule the next additional investigation to help us understand more of the contaminant, how it's traveling, where it's coming from, and where it's heading. And we're going to evaluate the risk connected to all of those steps. So the final report is available to anybody that would like to have it. We will publish it on a website in the near future so that people can get a copy of it or look at it. And we'll continue to do that with all the data and reporting investigative documents that we create from this point forward, everybody. So I want to thank you for your time and attention to this summary of what we've done and what we've found during our first phase investigation. And I appreciate the state for sponsoring this forum and this public meeting. And with that, I'll conclude my talk and turn it over to the representative from Cherry Capital Airport, Mr. Kevin Klein.
And thank you very much, Greg and Commander Hall. I appreciate that information. And I also want to thank all those participating in the community for their patience and commitment to getting through with this project. I also would like to take a moment to thank Eagle for assisting with the funding of the municipal water hookups. East Bay Township, Beth Friend, and all those that support it for applying for the grant and administering the program through construction of those hookups. I greatly appreciate it. I like to also thank Grand Traverse County, part owner of the airport, for providing the additional fundings to fill the gap from the grant to cover the entire cost of those municipal hookups. So thank you all for doing that hard work and that heavy lift at the initial onset of this program. Cherry Capital Airport continues to work with all stakeholders involved with PFAS on airports. PFAS chemicals are associated with firefighting foam or aqueous film forming foam, which all commercial service airports are required by the Federal Aviation Administration to use to effectively suppress fires. PFAS knowledge is growing nationwide, but Michigan is a leader in this field. Many states still lag behind on testing and cleanup criteria. Michigan is a true leader in this regard. The FAA continues to work on PFAS alternatives with goals to have alternatives approved by the end of 2021 or potentially early 2022. The Department of Defense has indicated that they are on track for their alternatives for 2023. TVC is committed to keeping everyone updated with our progress. Will you please take us to the next slide? Cherry Capital Airport's commitment to the community and the transparency of our information will be located on our website at tvcairport.com. If you go to that website, you can go across the top where you see flights, airport, visitors, and information. As you click on the information, there'll be a drop-down panel. It'll say planning, environmental, and zoning. Click on that. That will take you to our page, which our page outlines the commitment of the Airport Commission. And at the bottom left-hand side, you'll see the link. And when you click on that link, that will take you to the historical perspective on PFAS. We'll begin similarly to the Coast Guard information of our summary of our site investigation. Cherry Capital Airport did do groundwater and soil sampling. PFAS and PFOA were detected above criteria. In the soil samples, it was in the areas 1 and 4. PFAS, to the extent it has not been delineated laterally or vertically. And we also conclude the same with the aquifer believed to be bounded vertically by the underlying clay unit. Potential source areas include the current and former aircraft rescue and firefighting buildings where we stored our AFFF chemicals, and also the training areas that are associated with those buildings and areas on the airport. Other aircraft maintenance areas that where different fluids, hydraulic fluids and others could be used that could have contained PFAS. And historical operations were reviewed going back to the Navy, City of Traverse City operation of the Airport Commission information. Additional investigation is needed to define the extent of the contamination, as our current samples that we've taken do not reflect the quantity and chemical makeup that Eagle has reported on or near Parsons Road. Data will be always available on Cherry Capital Airport's website at tvcairport.com, including tonight's presentation by the airport will be up on that site tomorrow morning. So we will do our best to keep that as up to date, up to minute as possible for the community. At this time, I'd like to introduce Adam Siegerlin of Gosling Zubeck to continue forward with our presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. So we're going to start the presentation similar to the way that we started our investigation. As Kevin mentioned, we identified some areas of historical interest based on previous operations and previous uses as far as buildings, the ARF or the aircraft fire buildings. These areas identified on this slide as areas 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which is to the very south. We'll show that a little better in the next slide. But within areas 1, 3, and 4, we collected soil samples from those areas because of the historic uses in that vicinity. And we identified within areas 1 and area 4 PFOA exceedances of Eagle criteria for PFAS in soil. The areas 1 and 4 are also areas where there are stormwater detention ponds. So there's ponded water in those areas. And so we collected surface water samples or detention water samples and analyzed those for PFAS as well. And PFAS compounds were detected in the pond water and in those detention ponds. If you would jump to the next slide, please. So with that understanding of the soil and the detention pond water samples, we proceeded with a groundwater investigation. The dark colored symbols that kind of run vertically north and south across our figure, those are the monitoring wells that were installed in November of 2020 as part of our groundwater assessment. Also shown on this figure are some lighter gray wells kind of around the perimeter of the airport property. Those wells were installed in March of this year to assist with delineation of the contamination. Those wells are scheduled to be sampled later this month. On this figure, you also see blue groundwater contours. Those are elevation contours. And that's how we calculate groundwater flow directions. So you can see from the darker blue arrows that we are predicting a north-northeast flow direction based on the elevation of groundwater in the monitoring wells that were sampled in December. If you would proceed to the next slide, please. So this is a summary slide similar to what Greg with the U.S. Coast Guard had presented. We're using the same coloring scheme. So the blue bubbles that you see are wells that we have sampled using US EPA's low flow sampling methods. And they were determined to have concentration of PFAS chemicals less than drinking water criteria. And then increasing concentrations using, again, same coloring scheme, greater than criteria, less than 100 in the yellow. And then our highest concentrations were the red locations that had a PFAS chemical with a concentration between 1,000 and 10,000. So as you can see here, the additional monitoring wells that we've installed and are working towards sampling, those are intended to help define the boundaries of our plume and also to help identify possible sources of contamination that could be coming onto the coast or onto the airport's property from sources upgrading of the airport. Another thing I'd like to point out on this slide is of the chemicals that, so we sampled the monitoring wells for 28 PFAS chemicals as required by MPART. And of those 28 PFAS chemicals, we identified 3 chemicals that exceeded drinking water criteria. Those are PFOS, PFOA, and PFNA. So it's a slightly different chemical makeup than what was observed in the preliminary work done by others on this project. So if you would proceed to the next slide, please. So similarly to Greg's slide, this is a very data intensive slide, but this provides you with a comparison of the 7 PFAS chemicals that have drinking water criteria for them. We show those results in these box plots here and highlight the results in yellow that exceeded criteria. And again, you can see a majority, or I should say, we had PFOA in higher concentrations generally than PFOS. Our highest concentrations are down in area 4, right where the cursor is there, that red dot. Our PFOA concentrations were 3,000 nanograms per liter, 3,000 parts per trillion. The PFOS concentration of just over 100 or just under 150. One thing of note, we did not have very high, we had very low concentrations of the PFAS chemical PFHXS. So as we move forward, that's something we'll continue to look at as we try to identify source areas and differentiate possible plumes between source areas. So, you know, the chemical makeup, the ratios, if you will, of the different PFAS compounds are important as we look forward and try to identify where chemicals have come from. So if you would, maybe the next slide. So as we look forward, we also are looking to coordinate our activities on the airport with the Coast Guard and EGLE. As has been stated previously, but it's worth reiterating this. This is an iterative process. There's more sampling to be done to fully delineate and meet our regulatory requirements. And as we do so, we'll continue to evaluate cleanup needs and options as may be necessary. With that, I'll turn it back over to Kevin Klein with the Airport Authority.
Thanks, Adam. I greatly appreciate you sharing that information. And again, thank you to all those that are involved. We want to reiterate that this is the beginning of our understanding of what is out there. We're working very hard to determine that path to delineate what is out there. And then as Adam said, it will fully evaluate all the cleanup needs and options for remedial action as we go forward into the future. I want to also state, remember, please, all the up-to-date information will be on our website at tvcairport.com. At this time, I'll turn it back to Ann Emmington from Eagle.
All right. Ann, you might be muted.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Thank you, Ann.
All right. So we just heard a little bit from the Coast Guard and from the airport about their investigations and where those investigations are leading them. So I thought I would tell you where Eagle's next steps are going to be. The first and foremost reminder that the municipal wells were replaced, and that was a good thing. I keep saying that, municipal wells. The residential wells were replaced with municipal water hookups. But I wanted to alert residents that there are still irrigation wells out in this subdivision. And those irrigation wells are at the same risk that the residential wells were for being contaminated. So if you know of irrigation wells that are on your property or on your neighbor's property, these need to be inventoried, and we need to evaluate what the risks are from those wells. So if you have information that you have a well on your property, please contact me, and I will be putting together a list of all the wells in the area, irrigation wells, and relaying that information to both DHHS and to the airport and the Coast Guard for future actions. Eagle is going to continue to review all of the data that is generated by the Coast Guard and Cherry Capital Airport, try to work collaboratively with them to make recommendations where we feel additional investigations are needed, and possibly cleanup to the cleanup as necessary to protect human health and the environment. So we'll be working with both entities and any other entities that may be identified to continue the investigation process. Then as that investigation information becomes available, Eagle's going to share that information with you on the MPART website and through potentially future public meetings if there is interest in that manner. We want to stay on top of this. We want to make sure that everybody's protected and that this project keeps moving forward. I think I'm going to turn it back over to Abby at this point, and she's going to talk about the Citizens Advisory Group.
Thanks, Ann. Yeah, so part of one of the critical pieces of MPART is to really get input from our citizens, especially our citizens who have been through this, having to deal with contamination, with potentially drinking contaminated water. So we really get valuable insight and input from them. And I know that there's some of our Citizens Advisory Work Group members are actually on this call and are helping us to make our presentations better, make sure that we're connecting with the people who are most at risk and mostly need the information. And so this work group are the residents from these impacted communities around the state. We've got over 30 different people on this work group, but the meetings are open to everybody. So if anyone is interested in listening into our citizen advisory work groups or becoming a member, I will show you the webpage here in just a moment, but our key charges for this group is to really help us to engage and empower these communities so that they have a voice at the table. And then how do we connect? How do we do a better job of educating our general public about the risks of contamination to residential drinking water wells? So I think that's really important. If you can go to the next one. So I'm going to take you, this is our MPART PFAS Action Response Team logo, and there's a hot link here that will be in presentation when we get all done. But our partners of MPART are really key in this response. So I want to take and steal the screen for a minute, Anne. Yep. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So hopefully you should be seeing my screen now. So this is the MPART PFAS Action Response Team web page. So all you have to do is put in MPART, M-P-A-R-T, into any of your Google browsers and it'll show up. What you'll come up with is this web page, and we've got some popular pages here. What I want to show you today is that if you go to this PFAS sites, both the Cherry Capital Airport and the US Coast Guard are on this list. So right now we're at 162. This will probably be 163, 164 sites, and all in alphabetical order. So it's very easy to find. Cherry Capital is right there. So you'll click on it. Takes you to a hot link. It'll have a map that you can click on to see the information closer, but it'll have a pretty good update. So as Anne gets additional information from the airport, she gets additional information from the Coast Guard, they will both be on here. They're two separate sites, so they'll both be on this website for you to keep track of, you know, additional data. If she gets any additional information, or if we have updates for public meetings, upcoming community engagement activities around here, as well as just tracking some of the groundwater monitoring and other data stuff. We will be putting that all on our website. And the same thing for the Coast Guard. That also has its own site, again, has their maps up and any additional information. So I really want to make sure you guys all saw that in action. Those just went live today. It's a brand new sites, brand new information, and it is there for your investigation. The other piece I want to show you though, if we go back to the popular pages here, our Citizens Advisory Work Group is right here on that. And if you have any inkling or want to get involved, want to feel like, this experience is something that you want to expand on and be able to have a voice at the table, come join us. We meet once a month, and we've got a charter here. We got a little list of our members, some membership registration, not a big deal, but there's also the COG calendar, which is where we have not only our regular meetings, but our subcommittee meetings are both right there, and those are all open to the public. So I want to have you come join us for that. All right, so Anne, I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe you want to put your presentation back up so we can work from that for the question and answer time. And Les, I think you were going to probably bring us back and have us talk through how to do questions and answers.
Sure. Just I'm waiting for Anne to put the slides. You can just reshare, Anne.
Or I can do it, whichever. Okay.
You taking it, Abby?
I'm taking it.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. No worries. All right. Hey, Abby, if you can go ahead and put that in slideshow for me.
Let me put that in slideshow just a second.
So while Abby's doing that, thank you to all the presenters this evening for providing a great wealth of information. Undoubtedly, there's many questions. We do have some that have already come in through the Q&A this evening, so we'll be getting to those shortly. We do have a couple of listeners on the phone this evening. For those on the phone, I want to start with you. If you have a question for our panel and you would like to ask your question of the panel, you can select the pound key followed by the number 2 key to electronically raise your hand. And myself and Jim Ostrowski, who is my co-host, and I see some folks that already raised their hand, but for those on the phone, you can select the pound and the number 2 key to electronically raise your hand. Jim Ostrowski and myself will be monitoring for raised hand. For those that are watching and one person has already raised their hand, feel free to do that. There's a hand icon located at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to raise your hand electronically there as well, and we will be looking for that. If you don't feel you want to ask your question out loud, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A, which is also located at the bottom of the screen in Zoom. And as many of you probably have observed, just before we get into the questions, we had roughly 47 or so attendees on the webinar this evening. That included several on the phone at one point. So we had several folks on, so I wanted to share that with you. And we do have several supporting cast, phone of friends, as we like to call them, for helping answer questions. So with that, Abby, if you're ready and the team of panelists and presenters are ready for the questions, I will start with the first question.
I think we are. Let's go for
Okay.
it.
So the first question this evening, there was a question concerning nanograms per liter and if the results can be calculated into parts per trillion.
Mhm.
I think more of a comment.
That is a direct translation from nanograms per liter to parts per trillion is a 1-to-1 ratio. So no need for conversion.
Thank you. Next question. This one may be for Department of Health and Human Services staff. The data shown in the average blood PFAS concentration slide ends in 2014, which is 7 years old. Isn't there more recent data available from the CDC and other organizations? Would be great if the data was specific to Michigan.
Hi, this is Rosa. I can answer that question. So the current public information that we have provided by the STSCR provide information until 2014. However, in there you can find more information about that study done by NHANES. And when I talk about NHANES, I mean the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And you can go to the STSCR webpage under PFAS and your health, and you can find more information about this. There are a very early release of information of more recent data about NHANES study in the CDC webpage. You just have to go to the CDC webpage and under National Report on Human Exposure to Environmental Chemicals. And the information provided is slightly different than the one provided in the STSDR webpage. And about the second one, unfortunately, currently, we don't have this data specific to Michigan.
Okay, thank you, Rosa, for the answers.
Yeah.
Next question. It's been said that PFAS generally does not penetrate the skin. As some long chain, bear with me, the screen changed. Okay, as some long chain PFAS are being substituted with short chain PFAS, could short chain PFAS penetrate the skin easier?
So this is Rosa again. So the amount of PFAS that cross the skin is very, very limited. So that's the reason why it don't represent main health concern. So far, we don't have enough research for us to say that the short chain are significant different than the long chain of PFAS.
Okay, thank you, Rosa. Next question. This question is for the Coast Guard. It concerns collection of samples near the oil water separator. Could you touch base on that for Mr. Carpenter about sampling that was done in the vicinity of the oil and water separator?
Absolutely. If you could go to our presentation slide 3,
Okay.
that's a great.
Is this the right one?
Yes.
Okay,
If you look at that, and that's a great question, thank you for that. When we did the first cut at what sample location we had, we wanted to start with our perimeter. And we knew because of the hashed areas where we stored the AFFF that has the PFAS in it. You can see at the north, right below that, the start of the blue arrow, those tanks, that's the deluge system that actually can activate and push water and AFFF into the hangar. And right below that tank on the right is the oil water separator. You can see it labeled there. We'll absolutely center in on the source areas that the data showed us on this phase, and we'll concentrically go in and then out on the next phase to better understand the data gaps that we need to collect to better our understanding of what's actually happening at the Coast Guard facility. So that will be on the next phase. Thank you for that question. I hope I answered that well for you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll come back. Next question. This one's for Eagle staff. Some of the slides showed an outfall discharge with sediment plumes into apparently Grand Traverse Bay, near 3 Mile Road. Is Eagle going to collect both a downstream sediment sample from Grand Traverse Bay and a sample of the discharge water from the outfall to assess if Grand Traverse Bay is being polluted by PFAS?
okay. Maybe Ann, she's talking about this particular slide.
Set along 3 Mile.
Is this
Which
3
is-
Mile?
That's 3 Mile over there.
Yeah,
Maybe she's talking up, right around that area. There are no plans for Eagle to be collecting samples at that location. I think that's going to be outside of the PFAS plume area. It'll all depend on what happens with this next investigation and those new wells that Sherry Capital Airport put in further east to see if there's any contamination that comes up there. But no, Eagle has not planned to do any sampling of the outfall that's Mitchell Creek that goes into
right here.
Grand Traverse Bay, right? I don't think Mitchell Creek is going to be a receptor of the PFAS contamination. Just from previous studies on different sites in the area, I think that the contamination is down deeper. It'll probably go below Mitchell Creek if it even gets over in that far to the east.
So Ann, I think that's one of the other questions is when will East Bay and Mitchell Creek be tested? And I'm assuming that we will evaluate the data as it comes in to see if that's necessary. Would you agree with that?
Yes. You can't, yes, we're not going to jump all the way to the bay right now. We don't have, to be quite honest with you, it should be the responsible parties that conduct their investigations, not Eagle. So it's their responsibility to find the extent of the contamination. So we're going to let them move forward and do their next phases and see what they show. We'll make recommendations along the way if we feel that the bay needs to be sampled.
That being said, though, Ann, there are statewide efforts to look at surface waters, lakes, our streams and stuff as a coordinated effort to get a survey and understanding of PFAS levels in all of our surface water bodies. So there is random sampling going on, and I'm not sure about East Bay, but I would be very surprised if we haven't gotten to East Bay. As
East Bay was sampled, I think in
Okay, good.
2015, I believe, but it wasn't in this area. It was further out into the bay. I don't know if there's a schedule by surface water quality people to collect any more samples. I'm not familiar with what their sampling schedule is.
Thank you, Ann.
Okay, thanks, Ann. Abby, I see another question related to sampling of the east arm of Grand Traverse Bay. I think that would fall in line with the similar answer here?
Yeah, I think so. I think with all of these, that when it comes to, like Ian said, as the Coast Guard and the airport continue to define their contamination, if it extends off-site of the airport, then they would follow that. If it looks like it's discharging into the east arm of Grand Traverse Bay, then they would, they would have to define that. They'd have to look at both the, the vertical component as well as the horizontal, how much of it's getting in, what's those concentrations. That would be their responsibility. But from an MPART standpoint, the state's done that comprehensive testing of water bodies around the state. I have not heard of anything, elevated levels and anything around in this area. But as Ann says, I'm not exactly sure about Mitchell Creek if that's been tested, but that's something that we could definitely look into.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Ann. Another question regarding water sampling is how frequently is the municipal water being tested for PFAS?
So my understanding, this is Beth Friend with East Bay Township. My understanding is that PFAS, and Eagle could probably correct me if I'm wrong, is sampled on a quarterly basis with municipal water systems. With respect to the overall quality of the water, we just, when we had heard of this and we knew we were going to have several municipalities link into the municipal water system that have been on contaminated wells, we wanted to ensure that if they had any questions of the water, that we had a recent sampling. So we moved up the date of our regular water quality assurance with Eagle, or with the state of Michigan, and we had no issues with our water samples.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so as just on to expand on that a little bit farther, all of the municipal drinking water systems across the state are regulated by the state of Michigan under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they do go through regular testing. So if they had any PFAS detections, they would go to quarterly sampling. If they had, significant levels, then they would go to even more frequent sampling and some mitigation efforts. But again, I don't recall that Grand Traverse had any of those types of situations, which is probably why they're on the quarterly. So that's watched pretty closely. So that should not be an issue here.
Okay.
The other thing that I was wondering with the other question about East Grand Traverse Bay being sampled is that's not where East Bay Township gets its water, but I do know that that's where a large portion of the region gets their water through the city of Traverse City, where they draw their water from. And they obviously, as a municipal system, are tested regularly for PFAS as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point, Beth. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I know this question here about East Bay and Mitchell Creek was previously answered.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question here has multiple parts. Rosa, you might be on deck for some of the questions here, or at least one of them. But the first question, Abby, you might want to help me out here because I'm not certain what the first question is, so I'm going to come back to that one. But the second question deals with PFAS detected in soil. So if PFAS was detected in the soil on the airport, do the residents that were impacted have to worry about growing vegetables?
You can probably go to the next part of it. She does her own
Okay.
canning, and can residents get reimbursed for canned
For
food
canned food, yep.
that was done in PFAS water? So Rosa or Bill, you guys want to talk about the growing vegetables and any kind of vegetable gardens questions?
Yes, I can answer the second question. So we know that we know that plants absorb PFAS. However, there are so many unknowns for us to say that for us to say the amount of PFAS that your plants in your garden will have. For example, there are so many things that can make this variability, like the amount of PFAS that is in the soil, the type of plant, and the amount of PFAS that is in the water that you add to your plants. So for that reason, it's very difficult for us to say, that your plants are going to have, high or no levels of PFAS, or just to say the amount of PFAS that is going to be in your plants or in your fruit and veggies. If you are concerned, I see here that you are concerned about the soil. So if you're concerned about the soil, to mitigate the risk, you can use a raised bed garden, and you can cultivate your veggies and fruit in this raised bed garden, and use a soil. Yes, and use a soil that is not contaminated with PFAS. Go ahead, Bill.
Hi, my name is Bill Farrow. I'm a toxicologist with DHHS. And just to expound on what Rosa said, just to be clear, the question referred to the detections of PFAS in soil at the airport. I want to make the distinction between that and how that got there versus potential PFAS in soils in people's residences where they may be doing gardening or something. At the airport, you have the PFAS in the soil as a result of activities, using foam and that type of thing. So what happens is with precipitation, that PFAS migrates down through the soil into the groundwater. And then it migrates in groundwater to the residents, and it gets in their wells. So people who may be using wells that are impacted with PFAS, and let's say using for gardening, that watering their vegetables, that's where you have potential to introduce PFAS into the garden products as well as the soil. So just to be clear, the soil at the airport with respect to PFAS is the concern for the potential source getting to residents in their drinking water. So there's not a direct correlation between the soil at the airport, meaning that the soil in the residences, it's not the same thing. There's a migration pathway for which the soil at the airport serves as a source for impacting the groundwater. And then residents using that groundwater for household activities like gardening and that is where they introduce PFAS. And as Rosa said, there's all kinds of factors. We do know that garden products, plants absorb PFAS. Unfortunately, there's just not enough information to help us understand what the risk is from that exposure pathway.
Hey,
Yeah.
thanks. Sorry, go ahead.
We're just going to follow up. The final question then was about taking a bath in the water with PFAS, and if whether or not there would be any additional risk based on, soaking in a tub. Even though, just because the duration might be a little bit longer. I think it might be important, Rosa or Bill, to, just talk briefly about when these values were calculated, they were using a very long exposure of like a 30-year type of time frame to do these calculations so that they're very protective.
Yeah, and I guess I can start off, Rosa. And I think I think the important thing to understand is that the skin is a very strong natural defense barrier. Again, I mean, the skin is designed to protect against chemicals being introduced into the skin, but it's not completely impermeable. So there is, as with any chemical exposure, there is some absorption through the skin, but typically, again, because of the way the skin is constructed in that, it serves as a good barrier for absorption through the skin. So when we talk about when we talk about skin absorption and stuff, we typically say that skin absorption does occur, but exposure and the potential health concerns associated with it is minimal relative to other pathways of exposure where you get greater exposure, like drinking the water. And we have done studies on exposure to PFAS in surface water through like swimming and recreational activities. We've done that as part of our assessment of exposure to foam on surface water bodies. And we found, and looking and doing the risk assessment, we make assumptions about an individual, particularly an infant, someone, a more susceptible population, basically sitting in the surface water body for, an hour, I think 2 or 3 hours a day, 3 or 4 times a week. And based on the concentrations that we see in the surface water bodies, the skin exposure through the skin is typically not a concern. So again, when we talk about skin exposure, we talk about it in terms of relative to other routes of exposure where you get more significant exposure and more and consequently more of a public health concern.
Perfect. Thank you,
Thank you,
Bill.
Bill. All right, Abby, our next question is for the airport. The retention pond under the presentation indicated high concentrations in area 4. What are the potential PFAS sources that flow into the retention pond?
Okay.
This is Kevin Klein. I'll be happy to take that question. Area 4 is where the current fire station is located on the airport. Potential sources is that the fire trucks and fire apparatus and the storage of chemical take place at that fire station within Area 4.
Go back. Sorry, I think I'm messing up these slides. Here, I can go back and we can go back to that particular one so we can talk about it. There we
I'd
go.
just like to add also that there's been releases through the underground sewers near that fire department area that discharge directly into the pond. And specifically a number of them in 2020, which were addressed by the airport, but that still resulted in some contamination flowing into that pond. And that's probably why you're seeing the higher concentrations there. There are more recent releases.
And thank you, Ann. And those were cleaned up as you stated. And also that pond there does not discharge to any surface waters.
It's good to know. Okay.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Presently, we do not have any more questions in the Q&A, and we presently do not have any electronic hands raised. Again, just for those that are on the phone, we still have 2 people on the phone with us. That's great. If you have a question for the panel tonight, you can push the pound and the number 2 key to electronically raise your hand to talk with the panel. And for everybody else, feel free to either type some more questions. We have some time here to type in your question or to raise your hand if you have a question for the panel.
Hey, Les, this is
Yeah.
Amy Peterson.
Hi, Amy.
I do have some additional information that we actually included in the October town hall. A little bit about the drinking water in the area and some of the results, as well as some of the surface water sampling that was done. So if I could share my screen real quickly, I could share that with people real quick. I might answer a couple more questions.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Amy.
Okay, so how do I do that now?
So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a green up arrow that says share screen. You click that and you will have to pick your window that has your information. Mm-hmm.
All right. And can you see my screen yet?
Not yet, it's coming. All right.
Excellent. So yeah, this is from the slide deck that we used back in October. And so you can see the 2 different drinking water systems. The Traverse City system intake was sampled 7 times in October, between October and 2018 and September 2019. All but one of the samples then was non-detect. There was 1 sample taken in July 2019, and it had 3 parts per trillion PFOA and PFOS combined, a total PFAS of 5. So I believe that's what put this into quarterly monitoring, as Beth had suggested. In East Bay Township, They're using groundwater for their source. The wells are up gradient, side gradient, the most likely sources to the groundwater. This was sampled in October of 2018. Those 3 samples were all non-detect. And I'm fairly certain under the new Safe Drinking Water Act, these guys have done some additional sampling since then. When it comes to the surface water, I will blow this up to make it bigger for you, but I tried that about 5 minutes ago and it blew my machine here. So sorry about that. Surface water wise, this was some surface water samples that were shared with us in the October presentation. Samples collected May, July, and September 2019. And the southern area, you can see some pretty low results of 1.9 parts per trillion PFOS, 2.2 parts per trillion PFOS, and then in the northern area, we also had low results of 1.8 and 3.8 parts per trillion PFOS, the standard being 11. So with the sampling done in 2019 looked pretty good. And then fish, but we did collect some fish, lake whitefish in 2016 in the east arm of Grand Traverse Bay. The PFOS range from 3 to 12 parts per billion, which did not warrant a fish consumption advisory. That's all.
Perfect. Thanks, Amy, for the phone to friend on that one. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, did we get any more questions, Les?
Yes, we do. We have a few more questions that have come in. Abby, if you wouldn't mind just resharing your screen, that would be
I sure
great.
would.
Thank you.
Okay.
So the next question that we have deals with the material data safety sheets. Do material data safety sheets show all the constituents in a given product or only the major constituents?
That is a great question. And I don't know if anybody wants to add additional information, but generally it is, I don't know if there's a percentage, but generally it's like the stuff that's at the percentage range. So there could be some low level of what they consider insignificant that may be, you know, a surfactants or something like that. And so we don't always know from a material data safety sheet if things have PFAS in them. But it's the first step in trying to understand what materials are in any given product.
Okay.
Anybody want to add to that?
I know when I talked to Century Cell, the one that had the fire along Arrow Park Drive, they went back to the manufacturers of the products. They went beyond the MSDS sheets and spoke to the manufacturers of the products, and we were sure that there was not PFAS materials, you know, within their products that they were using. I don't know that the other two did that, but I know Century Tel did, because I spoke directly with their environmental person on staff. So could it be seen as a low-level contaminant within a product? I don't know. I don't have enough information on PFAS and MSDS sheets to answer that question. So,
Okay. Right. Thanks, Ann. And Ann, you might stay here for this one. The question concerns whether there are any other sources and if Eagle's investigating further. You may have touched on this already earlier, but can you address this question about any further investigation?
well, the question was, did we just ask them and they said no? That is not what they did. They provided their MSDS sheets to say that they looked. So it wasn't just Joe Schmo from the company. It was somebody that handles their environmental end of their companies that actually looked into the information. So if there's information out there that people are aware of, you know, that I am not aware of, then I'm always open to looking at it, information. The other piece of information that you are not aware of is it IPP, Abby?
Yeah.
Industrial Pollution Prevention Sampling?
Pre-treatment program. So yeah, the state went through and for all of the municipal wastewater treatment plants, so the sanitary sewers, as those municipal wastewater treatment plants have programs for the bigger cities that have industries that discharge directly to the wastewater treatment plant, they made each of those wastewater treatment plants go through their dischargers and look at if they had any potential sources of PFAS that from those industries. The industries were then supposed to be, they were sampled themselves, they sampled, and we determined if through this industrial pretreatment program, if there was any PFAS, significant PFAS sources coming into the wastewater treatment plant, because all of the wastewater treatment plants in the state were sampled. And we did find some really significant sources of PFAS from some of our metal finishers, platers, that kind of stuff. And so when I asked the staff who dealt with that program in this area specifically about the industries in this particular part of the airport, to give us a rundown on any of the industries in this area that would have been participating either in that IPP program or had discharges, they didn't know of anything of any significant sources. And I know from my experiences around the rest of the state that, you know, even a system that is discharging, maybe not have a groundwater plume, but they do have stuff sloughing off into their wastewater, we would see that. And the wastewater treatment plants also have to meet water quality standards so that they can discharge to surface water. And so they're also held to this surface water standard of 11 or 12 parts per trillion. So the wastewater treatment plants definitely don't want to see that coming into their systems. And so we've got a pretty good handle on where those hotspots are around the state from that particular program as well. And so that's a really big piece of this puzzle of trying to figure out if we had additional sources. But I think, you know, it's an ongoing investigation. If other things come to light, if Anne gets additional information, you know, she's going to follow up on it. I think that's always our obligation and our responsibility to the residents to be able to follow up on that kind of information and make sure we've got a full picture of the potential risk to public health.
Okay, thanks, Abby. The next question deals with, it goes back to the municipal water testing. The question relates to whether or not do we have results for the first quarter of 2021 for East Bay Township and for Traverse City.
The best place to find the answer for that, at least from a local perspective, is to contact the Grand Traverse County Department of Public Works. Grand Traverse County's DPW operates and maintains the water system for East Bay Township, and they would have all of those documents on file, and including obviously the most recent up-to-date ones.
Mm-hmm. There are also the sampling results from all of the municipal water sampling from around the state is also posted to the MPART website. So if you go on the MPART website under drinking water, there's a whole tab of all the different sampling events, including the statewide sampling that was done in 2018 to get a survey of who had PFAS in the drinking water and who didn't. 2018, 2019, 20 is up there. And I think we're making preparations to get the next set of data back and out there, hopefully as early as next week, so that that information can be available for people to review.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you, Beth, for the answer. Abby, could you zoom out to the MPART slide?
Sure.
Or if we have a contact slide.
Well, there's this one, but that's not really what you want. Why don't we go to, so we'll start with the introduction slide because I think that had everybody's names on it.
Yeah.
So this has got everybody's names, and then everybody will get a copy. Anybody who signed in and linked into this is getting a copy of the slide deck, the PDF slide deck, so we can make sure everybody gets that. And then I believe with all of these sign-ins, there's Anne's name and number and her email. Rosa's is there.
These are good photo opportunities right here for phones. So.
Yes, I'm probably going too fast. And Beth Friend's name and email. We've got Greg Carpenter's for the US Coast Guard. And I think, yes, and Airport Director Kevin Klein is also on here with his phone number. So I think that's most of them. So you'll get the whole slide deck, and then we can, share all that stuff with you.
Okay. Yeah, we have no new questions that have come in. Just want to remind everyone, as I mentioned earlier, that we are recording the webinar. The webinar recording will be made available through Eagle's YouTube channel, where you can also not only find this webinar, but you can find other webinars concerning the PFAS discussion that is going on all around the state. So you can see those as well. And also the recording will be linked to the MPART webpage for East Bay Township. And Abby, we have a hand raised, so I'm going to unmute our one hand raised.
All right, excellent.
You have a
Hi
question?
there. Can
Hi
you hear
there. Yes.
me? Thank you, Les. I have a question, I guess mainly for Eagle and the DHHS folks. I'll identify myself. My name is Charlie Schlinger. I'm a resident of Traverse City and live near areas impacted by the East Bay Township PFAS plume. I daily drink water that is sourced, I believe, by Traverse City from the East Bay. And today I am speaking as a Traverse City resident who lives in close proximity to the airport. My question is a little bit involved, but here goes. How will Eagle and DHHS address cumulative environmental impacts on public health in this general geographic area near the Cherry Capital Airport related to the following 4 areas of environmental contamination? The first area is the one we're discussing here today, and I'd like to thank everyone for the presentations, which are most informative. And that would be the historic and presumably ongoing PFAS releases from the Cherry Capital Airport perimeter. Although, as was made clear by several of the presenters, the ultimate source or sources of the PFAS is still subject to investigation and discovery. Secondly, and this is something new that I've come across in the last week or two, historic and ongoing atmospheric lead emissions by Northwestern Michigan Community College's flight school operations. And this should surprise nobody. These occur predominantly over lower income neighborhoods near the airport. Preliminarily, I have estimated cumulative atmospheric lead emissions to be roughly 15,000 pounds over the past 53 years, with 2019 emissions of roughly 300 pounds. Thirdly, high levels of persistent, frequent environmental noise from the same college flight school, and to a lesser extent from the US Coast Guard. And finally, other possible contamination and environmental degradation of which others may be aware. Abby alluded to some of these earlier on, that I am unaware of and to which I cannot speak to at this time. So again, how will Eagle and DHHS address cumulative environmental impacts on public health in this general area related to the 4 sources that I just cited? Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, I think it's going to have to be done by multiple agencies and over time, right? As we become aware of things, that's where we work to mitigate those risks, just like we took those 18 houses off of contaminated drinking water and got them onto municipal water so that they were protected. That lowers their exposure. As the Coast Guard and the airport continue their investigation, if there's any other potential risks that are identified, again, they will work to mitigate those efforts. And the same thing with other, potential sources of contamination. If we find those other sources, if we identify anything else, then they too would go through the same process to reduce the levels, reduce exposure, mitigate that, and then work towards elimination. But it's all of a collaboration effort, right? The noise issue, I think, would be something that I'm going to look at the airport or at the Coast Guard. Is that regulated by the township, or would that be regulated by FAA as a potential concern?
Noise issues are regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration and monitored. At this time, all noise contours that are significant remain on the airport boundary, and all noise that are beyond that are not impacted off. So modeling has demonstrated through the various studies in recent years. So thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm. And Charlie, for your last question about the lead emissions, I don't have a good answer for you, but if you've got my contact information, if you've got specific questions, send them to me and I'll make sure our air quality folks can actually get you a real response, because that's not something that's in my universe. I don't have a good background in air toxics and the potential for atmospheric lead depositions. So if you want to, unless Bill, you got any information?
I was just going to add, I'm in terms of potential sources, we look at different potential pathways of exposure, and Rosa talked about the Eat Safe Fish program, the potential for these potential sources that you talk about contributing to impact to surface water, which would contribute to potential impact to fish. So fish sampling is done to assess residents' potential exposure to chemicals in fish, and they do analysis for not only PFAS but PCBs, mercury, other chemicals that bioaccumulate. So it's kind of a pathway specific evaluation, looking at all kinds of different pathways and how sources can contribute to exposure versus those particular pathways.
Bill, can I chime in for a minute? This
Yes.
is Charlie again. I wanted to qualify what I said earlier, and you wouldn't know this because you're not up here, and I didn't want to go on for 30 minutes in posing my question and incur the ire of all of you. The lead exposures that I'm talking about come from a very specific set of circuits that the flight school runs, again, usually over the same low-income neighborhoods adjoining the airport or near the airport, that are usually referred to in airport noise studies as areas of incompatible land use. Some of those residential areas predate the airport. And so the flight school flies very tight loops, take off, circle back, land, take off, circle back, land. And so they're constantly dusting the same few neighborhoods and the surroundings with lead, apparently. And their circuit takes them over near one elementary school that has programs for autistic children, and also takes them over another elementary school before they land and then repeat. They run about 30 to 35,000 operations a year, I'm told. Again, many of them over these same limited set of neighborhoods, not over the water, not over the rest of Traverse City. So it's a very focused area of emissions and presumably inhalation, exposure, and possibly ingestion.
That's a really interesting question, Charlie. And I don't think we're going to be able to give you a great answer tonight. But like I said, email me with the information and let me get you to the right people. Because our air quality, we don't have any air quality experts on the call tonight. But
Okay, thanks. Thank you. And
appreciate it. Good.
I'm sorry you had to suffer through that photograph of me.
Yes, that's a great photograph, Charlie. Thanks. All right. Do we have any other questions, Les? How are we looking?
At present, we have no new questions. And I did see a hand up temporarily, and he's back. So I will unmute Marcus.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. There's like 8 buttons I had to press. Sorry, this is Marcus Wasilewicz. I'm the section manager for the toxicology and assessment section at DHHS. And I just wanted to throw out a couple other kind of food for thought things out there is we do look at long-term public health effects of several chemicals statewide, PFAS being one of them. And we have a couple studies going statewide. And I do want to say this area is one that we don't plan to do a exposure assessment or a health study in right now, but we are in communication with local health and always evaluating if this would be a possibility for the future. Just to give somebody a time frame on this, these studies usually take several years from the planning to the reviewing to the initiation stage. So if we do initiate some sort of public health study in this area, it probably would be several years down the road that we'd be able to get the permission to go ahead and start it. And kind of in reference to another question earlier on about background PFAS levels in Michigan, we do have a study going called MyChem, Michigan Chemical Exposure and Monitoring Study, which is giving us a background of several chemicals in Michigan, PFAS being one of them. And that'll kind of be the Michigan version of the national NHANES study. So that'll give us a better idea of what the just general background information of several of these chemicals are for Michigan residents. So we're working on it, and we have some, I guess, some good projects going right now.
All right.
Thank you, Marcus.
And it looks like, sorry, I just asked, and it looks like we do, MyChem will involve background lead noise as well. So maybe that'll help kind of point out some of these neighborhoods that might have a bigger lead impact.
Cool.
Great.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks.
Thank you, Marcus. Abby, we have no new questions, and so we're approaching 8 o'clock. Just wonder if you or anyone else on the panel had any final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts are, thank you for your participation. Thanks for caring. We have heard a lot from these residents, and, Ann has worked very collaboratively, very hard with local officials, with the airport, with the Coast Guard to make sure that our residents have been taken care of. And so now that we're through that initial phase of assessing and getting everybody hooked up to municipal water. Now it's a longer stretch to get through the investigation phase, because it will be a couple series of investigations to really understand all of the contaminations. So I think look for periodic updates, because we will be updating the MPART webpage as those investigations come out. If you've got questions or concerns, please reach out to Ann. She's your best source of information. And otherwise, feel free to reach out to any of us. We have our MPART page has got our names and numbers on it. Otherwise, we're pretty easy to find. So just let us know if you got any questions. Really appreciate everybody helping us out tonight.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Thank you, Abby, and thank you, team. And thank you, Jim. Jim has been putting information, contact resources in the chat for you. Again, thank you for spending your evening with us. And with that, I wish you all a great evening, and that will conclude tonight's conversation. Have a great evening.
Thank you.